Now, you've watched the video. Do you think that this threat of taking God out of America is something that Americans should legitimately be concerned about?
Absolutely. Probably the most prominent reason is our entire Constitution and Declaration is premised on a belief in God and a Christian worldview. And to remove that from the equation, particularly in our legislative and governmental realm, is to remove what we're based on and how you properly can even interpret the Constitution. What does liberty mean if you don't understand it from a biblical perspective? And so practically we have to be concerned about it. Also, another very practical concern is the threat is the consequences we're going to face. And the video obviously talks about that, but real life consequences in our jobs, in our workplace, in schools. And so we have real reason to be concerned.
You speak about consequences. What would you expect those consequences to look like?
We're already seeing some of the consequences. For example, your ability to speak out about your faith in the workplace is being hindered. Your ability in schools as a student to respond to school projects with anything that's religious. The video talks about removing from our pledge. President Obama recently forgot "under God" in our Pledge of Allegiance. So things like that are really happening, but practical consequences. Workplace, churches are facing consequences of who they hire and fire based on their religious beliefs in the schools, and just your ability to, as a legislator, to speak out on your faith and not have that marginalized is something that we're facing.
People will claim that the Constitution does not actually make a reference to God, that the Declaration of Independence is the only founding document that does. When they say that, can we really look at this as a legal issue that needs to be dealt with, or is this something that has to be dealt with on a whole other level?
Sort of a two-part answer. First of all, the Constitution is actually signed in the year of our Lord, so it does have a biblical reference. But I like to look at the Constitution similar to a corporation, and your Constitution is your bylaws that tell you how you run a corporation. There's always something that precedes that. It's the Articles of Incorporation that gives you the purpose for your corporation. You have to read the Declaration and the Constitution together. What do the words of the Constitution mean? You figure that out by looking back to why did we declare our independence from England and create a new nation. They tell us that in the Declaration of Independence, which is obviously explicitly a religious document. And so that's the first thing, that you have to read them together. And to take God out drastically changes it. And I just think the best example is your understanding of liberty. Liberty, if you're reading it from a Christian worldview, means something very different than liberty without a Christian worldview, which essentially means a free-for-all, and government has no ability to place restrictions on you. So it means something. How are you going to interpret it?
Now, do you think that this issue is something that can be resolved at the legislative level, or is this something that has to make it way farther up in the ladder of authorities before it can really be dealt with effectively?
I think one thing the legislature could do, and it's been toyed around, bills have been introduced, is Congress actually has the authority to limit areas where Supreme Court can decide cases. So it could take jurisdiction away from the Supreme Court on any of these Establishment Clause religious cases, in which case the Supreme Court couldn't further mess up our jurisprudence in that area. That's one thing that could be done. And then the other thing is just passing protections for religious entities, as opposed to a Congress that seems fit to pass non-discrimination laws that are actually hostile to religious entities. So Congress has a role that it can play.
Okay. Do you think politicians, the video specifically references Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, is she Speaker of the House again? I'm just not up on my political versing right now.
I think she currently, I'm not sure either, I'm sorry.
It's just one of those funny things, like, too many names bouncing
I know,
around.
exactly. I believe she is.
The video specifically mentions Nancy Pelosi. Do you believe that politicians, especially on the liberal side, but politicians in general, are provoking this issue and really pushing it down the drain?
Yeah, I hate to say it falls along party lines, but it generally does. Again, you've got a Republican Party that, at least historically and for the most part, the conservative ones understand the purpose of our government and understand the freedom of religion that it's based on. And then you've got those on the other side in the moderate area, both Republicans and Democrat side and other political parties, who again go back to this other view that there is no God in our Constitution, and therefore government has no role placing restrictions. Of course, government also plays a very big part in imposing lots of things in our lives, but it's just their different idea of freedom and liberty and what we're based on, and ignoring our founders' warnings of what would happen when we took religious morals and religious values out of the equation and how we governed ourselves.
Now, from a law perspective, could this issue be looked at as not so much an issue of the separation of the church and state, does God have a place in government, but almost from the light of censorship, that the words of the Founding Fathers themselves are being edited to take out God, that it is an issue of censorship and not just separation of church and state.
Certainly censorship, whether it's a First Amendment censorship issue, I mean, you could view it that way, and particularly when somebody's trying to speak in a public square, they're trying to censor that, particularly when you think about hate speech laws. I mean, they are trying to censor you. Some people would say that simply telling the truth from the Bible is hate speech, and you shouldn't be allowed to do it on particularly sensitive issues. And so in that respect, it's censorship. But other than that, it does focus on an incorrect interpretation of our Supreme Court of the Establishment Clause and this balance between freedom of religion and, oh, wait a minute, we have to make sure we don't establish a religion, and how far the Supreme Court has taken that.
Hypothetically, we've talked about what would happen if this issue gets out of hand, that we've talked about the consequences of this issue, but non-Christian Americans obviously aren't going to be too concerned about this issue. If we can't get everyone on board, what do you see happening 2 years, 5 years, 10 years into the future?
I'd like to answer part of that first one. That's an implicit question there. You know, everyone really should be concerned about it. Right now, and this goes from generation to generation, you may love those who are in power. Looks like they're acting on your behalf, but when we give government that much control over what we say, what we do, how we run our lives, that could easily flip. And the next 5 years from now, you could be on the wrong side of the equation. So our job should be to limit government, because a strong government can be tyrannical. But I'm sorry, the second part of that question was?
The second part of that question was, if they're not going to be so concerned, you know, what do you see? You've kind of brushed on it. What do you see happening as the result if we really can't get a coalition of people working against this, if this is indeed something that is wrong that is happening in our government?
Yeah, I think the best thing we can do is try to let them look at what's happening in other countries, because we're not that far behind where other nations have gone, and it should be a warning to us of where we could go. And again, it's just this censorship. I mean, there's been a lot of fiction novels written about when government gets too big and controls what you say and what you do. It never ends well in those books, so even Hollywood writers understand that. And so we need to take a look at that and realize that if you want to have the freedom to run your company the way you want to run your company, to teach your children what you want to teach your children, regardless of what government thinks, this should be something everyone should be concerned about. And looking at other countries, you know, people are thrown in jail for things they say. There are countries that limit the internet and what you can access on the internet. That's not freedom. And so all freedom-loving Americans, regardless of their religion, should realize if we give government that much control, it can censor us, and we should be concerned.
All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.